Thank you and good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here. It's my pleasure to provide you with our perspective on the future of mobility in the MENA region. My name is Vitali. I'm part of mobility team at Frost Sullivan. What we do is we track different markets. I'm responsible for the mobility and automotive. When we typically speak about the Middle East, I try to focus on either GCC or the rest of the Middle East because MENA region is very, I would say, diverse. If you look at different countries spanning from Morocco to this GCC region, to Egypt, and so on, you see different trends, you see different dynamics. But in this presentation, I try to focus on the wider Middle East and North African region, and I'd like to provide you with our perspective on what we believe will happen to the market in the next 5, 7 to 10 years. So the presentation is relatively straightforward. I'll start with the major trends, then I'll focus on what will happen on the new mobility business models. Then we'll briefly speak about the subscription business models. Since it's an EV-oriented conference, I'll also touch upon the EV trends, and I'll end with a few key conclusions from our side. So what is happening in the mobility space in the Middle East and North Africa? First of all, most of you might be aware of the major trends, but what we would believe, mobility is changing. The way we approach mobility, the way we approach transportation on everyday base, on whether we're talking about commuting, whether we're talking about going to conferences, is changing. And I believe most of you might have noticed that. But we found out there are a few trends which are driving those changes. Some of those trends are known to you. There is no secret here. We just wanted to highlight what we think is changing the future of mobility in the Middle East and North Africa. And again, when we speak about the region, it's a bit different for the GCC, and it's also different for the rest of the Middle East and North Africa. But essentially, what is driving new business models? First of all, connectivity. In the GCC, the connectivity level, if we're talking about mobile subscriptions, is about 75% now. We believe it's going to hit 80% in the next 5 years. The rest of the Middle East, it's about 65, close to 70%. It's likely to get to 75% in the next 5 years. So we're seeing people getting more and more connected. Everybody has a smartphone today. Everybody has a data plan. Everybody has an application to order a taxi or ride-hailing service. At the same time, 7 million lives are being lost every year globally because of pollution. So that's a need, that's a pressing need, which most governments are realizing now. They are realizing that they have to address that challenge. GCC, Middle East is no exception. It's not only about pollution, it's also about road safety or the road safety hazards. Societal changes. A lot of people don't want to have cars. They don't want to drive cars, they don't want to own cars. And as an example, my brother, he's in his mid-30s, he's never owned a car in his life. He's fine using new mobility services. He doesn't need a car. Based on the global numbers, up to 20% of millennials don't want to drive. 9% of them don't have driving license. And that's something which we believe will continue in the future or accelerate in the future. So we think these are the trends which will drive the new mobility globally and also in the Middle East. And when talking about the new mobility, what we mean is shifting from personal car ownership to car usership, not just car, but also different transportation modes usership. Talking about forecasting or the future of mobility, it's always good to look at the present. So where are we today? Today, if you look at, and that's why we're talking about the differences within the Middle East region. If you look at the GCC, everybody drives cars. It depends on the city. We have metro in Dubai. There is metro coming up in Bahrain. In Qatar, the metro has been completed in 2019. So metro is being constructed in Riyadh as we speak. So it does vary from city to city, but here in the GCC, people love their cars. More than 70% of people use cars for transportation purposes. But the number is quite different for the rest of the Middle Eastern cities. If you look at Cairo, if you look at Casablanca, if you look at Tunis, more than 70% or 60 to 70% of people use public transportation. So the thing is, if public transportation is available, people tend to use it if it's convenient to use. There were a few thoughts being communicated at one of similar conferences a couple of years ago that people in the Middle East or specifically in the GCC do not ride bikes. And the main reason was not because it's too hot, it's too uncomfortable. It's mainly because offices do not have shower facilities. So if offices were to have shower facilities, people would probably start switching to riding bikes. But today, most of the transportation needs in the GCC are being served by personal cars. If we look at the rest of the Middle East, the situation is quite different. But what we're expecting is people starting shifting their transportation patterns from car-oriented, personal car-oriented, to mobility as a service, which includes everything which is not based on car ownership. It can include trains, trams, it can include bicycles, last mile connectivity, ride-hailing, car sharing. There's a number, at least 7 to 10 different mobility as a service business models which are available today, and we believe people are likely to start shifting to them as we speak. So if we compare the situation today with the situation in the next 5 to 10 years, what we believe is people are going to shift, maybe not necessarily at the same pace here in the GCC and the rest of the Middle East, from car ownership-oriented transportation towards towards new mobility business models based on mobility as a service. And I've already touched upon in a couple of those trends or a couple of those factors which are driving those changes. And the main ones are urbanization. Up to 75% of people by 2050 will be living in cities. Today the number is about 50%, and it was about 30% in 1970s, 1960s. So the situation is changing. Connectivity, everybody is connected. Pollution is becoming a big factor in our everyday lives. ESG is a big agenda for most companies, so fleets are expecting to be shifting to either environment-friendly transportation modes, or they're trying to shift to mobility budgets, which include different transportation modes, not just car-oriented. So those are the factors which we believe are going to push the mobility markets in the Middle East from car ownership base to car usership, driving the mobility as a service business models in the future. If we talk about mobility as a service, there are so many questions as to what it means, what are different types of mobility as a service. Basically, when we talk about mobility as a service, we refer to business models which are not based on car ownership transportation modes. So essentially, everything which is detached from personal cars can be mobility as a service. Could include trains, trams, as I mentioned, bikes, last mile connectivity, e-scooters. We're seeing that in the Middle East as well, especially here in the GCC. And just to help you visualize what are the different business cases or use cases for mobility as a service, we have a few examples. So anywhere where you cannot use your personal car is a great example for mobility as a service. For one instance is if you are driving to an airport, especially late night departure, you cannot rely on public transportation in some cases. You have to use ride hailing or car sharing solutions, and car sharing in Dubai, for example, is great. You can leave your shared car somewhere close to the terminal, take a taxi as the last leg of the last mile connectivity, get to the airport. Everyday commuting to work, commuting to universities. If the public transportation is not well developed, but also if it is, you can combine it with other mobility as a service solutions for your transportation needs. Off-peak hours, when there is not enough, or when there are enough taxis or ride-hailing solutions, that's another case when you can use mobility as a service. So the number of use cases is quite high. You can see that you can apply them in many different situations. Everybody has been using them. Everybody's familiar, I believe, but it just, we assign different definitions in some cases. It's just good to understand what we refer to when we talk about mobility as a service. So what does that mean to the mobility industry, either the GCC, Middle East, or globally? So first, I'll start with the global picture. Globally, we believe that 99% of new cars being sold by 2030 will be connected. The number is quite high, but if you look at the legislation, if you look at the regulations, which are pushing for e-call solutions, that makes your vehicles already connected. GCC is following some of those safety regulations, or there's a link to the European regulations. So e-call is coming to the GCC. Similarly, we are expecting to see that in the Middle East as well, the rest of the Middle East as well. So that will make 99% of vehicles connected. So what that means, most of those vehicles will be able to use some level of autonomous driving. Here we're talking about 16% by 2030, but we refer to highly autonomous vehicles, right? It's still pretty far from now. It's 2030. We're talking about 8 years from now. But imagine 16% of vehicles, newly sold vehicles, are expected to be highly autonomous, mainly because they will be connected, people will be connected, drivers will be connected as well. So talking about new mobility market or the shared mobility market, we're talking about 1.4 billion revenues by 2030. That's a big jump from the current level of 0.3 or 0.4 billion today. So that's a fourfold increase within the next 8 years. So we are expecting shared mobility to be the driver or to be benefiting from those societal technological changes that we are noticing today. And we expect that 60% of vehicles, newly sold vehicles by 2030 will be electric. So here, everybody is talking about electric vehicles, but the question is, how do we define them? So 60% does include hybrids or non-plug-in hybrids. If we talk about plug-in hybrids and battery electric vehicles, then we estimate the number will be about 24-25% by 2030. So what does that mean for the Middle East? Middle East is likely to be following some of those trends, but not necessarily at the same pace. So we are expecting the market for new cars to be shifting to those environmentally friendly vehicles, but not necessarily at the same rate as the global market. There are a few good things here. We're talking about the fact that most countries in Europe have already set up targets to get rid of non-EVs by 2030, 2035, 2040. So that will have a spillover effect on the Middle East as well. But at the same time, there will be manufacturers with still manufacturing IC, internal combustion engine based vehicles by 2030. So we still believe there will be room for those vehicles. Since there are limited overall targets in the GCC in the rest of the Middle East, with a few exceptions, we believe that the number will be likely lower. But this is just a scenario-based forecast. We expect that if we look at the optimistic scenario, up to 24, 25%, or 20% of the newly sold vehicles by 2030 could be electric, talking about plug-in and battery electric vehicles, but that's optimistic scenario. For now, given the level of subsidies, charging infrastructure state of development, we expect the overall percentage of sales to be close to 10% by 2030. So that's on the electric vehicle side. Quickly talking about, and we'll get back to electric vehicles as well. Quickly talking about what those societal technological factors mean for other mobility as a service business models. So first of all, subscription as a service is growing in this market as well. And why do we talk about subscription of vehicle subscriptions? Mainly because we see there is a need in the market. And if you look at the market today, you can see different types of mobility as a service, depending on the time frame that you need that vehicle for. If you look at long term, you can talk about your loans, car loans, which are typically taken for 3 to 5 years here in the GCC in the Middle East as well. If you don't need a vehicle for that long, you go for leasing. A lot of companies go for leasing. Leasing can also spend from 1 to 3 years, but essentially it starts from 1 year and it extends longer. If you look at anything which is less than 1 year, then you can look at car sharing, when you can rent a car for a couple of minutes, 1 hour, 2 hours, or a day. You can also look at rental. Rental can also spend from day to several days to several weeks. But there is a bit of a gap here when we're talking about using your vehicle for several months at a time, and then that's something which has been missing in the market. We've been showing this slide for the last, I think, 5 years. The subscription market is still picking up. It's slowly picking up, but we do believe that this subscription or subscription as a service will pick up in the future, because a lot of dealers, at least before the pandemic, before the situation was different, they were sitting on huge stocks of used or new cars. They were not utilizing them, or especially when they had huge stocks of used cars. They did start talking about subscription services to be able to utilize those used vehicles until they're sold to the end user. So we see a lot of demand, we see a lot of interest. It's still difficult to find the right business model here, but we are seeing that leasing companies are getting interested in the subscription services, but also dealers are getting interested, and also OEMs. Just to visualize that, the number of players or number of stakeholders in the subscription market is quite high. It does typically start with startups, small companies, because those are the real drivers of innovation. They are more prone to take risk. They are more happy to accept risk and see whether that will provide results in the future. So it usually starts there. Then we have technology companies which are providing platforms for subscription services. But then we can, if we look at the automotive or mobility ecosystem, then we see that every single stakeholder layer is involved. We look at small dealers, large dealers, then we look at mainstream OEMs, we also look at premium OEMs. And again, this slide It is quite old, but we did check some of the numbers, and most of the companies are still very much active in the subscription market. It's not super profitable to most of them. They're still trying to find the right business model. They're still trying to fine-tune it, but we are seeing a lot of interest and a lot of activities in the subscription business model. And what is interestingly, rental and leasing companies are becoming big on the mobility side because they do understand mobility. They have been providing mobility services for the last, for a very long time now. So looking at the future, and that was one of the, let's say, one of the business models. Looking at the electric vehicles, since this is an electric vehicle conference or event, what we've noticed is the market in the GCC, but also in the Middle East, is quite similar to the rest of the world, with a bit of a lag or a bit of advances depending on the area that we look at. But the factors which are limiting the development of the electric vehicle market are pretty much the same, with a few short-term challenges, but also long-term challenges. The first one is there is no subsidies no real subsidies in the market, which mean that the market is going to go with the second option, waiting for the global market to mature enough to bring the cost of electric batteries down. And we'll talk about the price differences a bit later. There are no subsidies. Charging infrastructure is just now starting to pick up. We spoke to Electromin yesterday. Electromin has already installed 100 charging stations in Saudi. For Saudi market, it's a big step up. The plans are much bigger than we look at the UAE. The situation is much more advanced. We have close to 300 charging stations. The situation is picking up as we speak. But there's still a lot of range anxiety here in the market, even considering the fact that 80% of charging would happen at homes. So in the short term, public charging stations are not as crucial to kickstart the market. The cost, and we've heard that many times throughout the presentation, throughout the conference here, the cost is #1 factor for the Middle Eastern markets. One of the interesting points is the residual values. For a long time, the industry believed that the residual values for electric vehicles were typically higher than those of internal combustion engines. Once there is more data points available in the market, now it's a bit clearer that either it's similar or it can vary depending on the model, depending on the situation. In some cases, it could also be lower than the residual value of those internal combustion engines. But what it means is there is still a bit of uncertainty in the market about when it's time to sell the electric vehicles, will people be able to get more for their used vehicle or than for the IC alternative or less? Still a big question, but we are expecting to see that the question will get answered pretty soon. And yeah, high cost of battery, that's something which everybody is aware of. We've seen a 7-fold drop within the last 10 years or so, but it still remains relatively high. At the same time, if we look at the GCC or the rest of the Middle East, and that's why I was referring to those two as to the region as to different sub-regions, there are a few favoring factors which are likely to support development of electric vehicles. And if we look at some of the leaders globally, such as US, Norway, European Union, availability of home charging is typically very important at the initial stages of the development of the market. GCC is quite close to those numbers. If we look at KSA, Bahrain, UAE, then the share of detached houses, we can talk about villas, townhouses, or conventional villas or traditional houses across the GCC. The penetration is quite high. It's about 55%, which means that 55% of households can immediately start charging their vehicles at home. So home charging is not an issue. I live in an apartment, so when I was considering buying an electric vehicle, that was a big factor for me. I could not charge an electric vehicle at home. It is a challenge. But for 55% of household, it's not. And the situation is quite similar to those of the EV leaders globally. So that's a factor which we believe will be helping to, or will be supporting the development of the EV market in the future. The rest of the Middle East varies quite significantly. Egypt, we look at Jordan, the percentage of households living in detached houses with access to their to garages or individual charging is somewhat of a challenge, and that's why even yesterday we were discussing the situation about how can public charging help bridge that gap, but it does not. I would say compares quite differently to the rest of the GCC or the Middle East. So the situations are different. Sorry, but we do see some positive developments which are likely to push that development of the EV market in the Middle East. First of all, Incentives are not there. The question is, are they required? And we've heard different perspectives over the years, and the overall understanding is they might not be required here in the GCC. Rest of the Middle East, we're seeing the situation a bit differently. But here, the overall approach is to wait for the market to mature, for the market to bring the cost of the batteries down to an acceptable level when the TCO comparison would be in favor of electric vehicles. And we'll talk about that in a second. And that's what we have to do. We have to wait for the market to mature to bring that cost down. Luckily, with the number of OEMs, number of brands moving into the electric vehicle space, it is happening organically. It is happening globally. Middle East is a very connected region, so we are very much connected. It's part of the global picture, so it will be positively impacted by those developments. Within the last, I believe, 7 years, 8 years, the cost of batteries has dropped. It's something that everybody is aware of. It's not at the point where it will make electric vehicles or total cost of ownership comparable. And even if it does, then still the upfront cost would be a bit of an issue, despite the fact that 60% of people here in the GCC buy vehicles on loans. So that would help bridge that gap. But at the same time, it is a positive development. Running cost of EVs obviously are much lower than internal combustion engines powered vehicles. But what is interesting, and I think people living in the UAE will refer to that, is it does provide you a bit more stable approach. If you look at the cost of petrol has varied or has gone up quite significantly in the last couple of months, following the cost of oil. But if you look at Saudi Arabia, the cost of petrol has increased, I think, by 275% over the last 5 or 4 years. So that's a big change. If you look at electricity, it's not going or it's not increasing at the same rate. So it will be providing a bit more stable or a bit more predictable running cost estimation for most owners. At the same time, one of the most interesting points here is if you look at the total cost of ownership of electric vehicles, and if you compare it with the total cost of ownership for internal combustion engines, you might see very different pictures. And I've been through a couple of panels here. I see people saying that it's already lower than the TCO of EVs is already lower than those of internal combustion engines. Some people are saying it's higher. We believe that the situation depends on the segment that you look at, but also it depends on the models that you compare. If you look at some of the basic comparisons, Tesla 3s can be compared to some of the other premium brands, and the TCO is already on the lower side. But if you go at a different segment, if you look at some of the mass brands, and you compare them to comparable or alternatives on the ICE side, then the cost or the TCO is still higher than that of internal combustion engines. But this situation is changing quite dynamically, quite quickly. So we believe that even that point will not be, I would say, it will change in favor of electric vehicles in the next 3 to 5 years when the TCO is likely to get on par with TCO of EVs is likely to get on par with that of internal combustion engines. So quickly, conclusions, and I think we might have about 5 minutes for any questions that you might have. So what that means for the region, and this is probably the most interesting slide, because if you think about it, everybody talked about electric vehicles about 5 years or 7 years ago. It was still a bit of a futuristic discussion. Everybody was expecting electric vehicles to come to the region. Nobody knew when and how, what would be the business models. We are seeing that is happening now. So Lucid Motors announced the investment in Saudi Arabia to be manufacturing 150,000 vehicles. Glory set up a facility to manufacture EVs here in the region. So we are seeing some activity on the manufacturing side, which is something you don't even see on the conventional vehicle side, mainly because the capacity requirement on the new mobility on the electric vehicle side still cannot be addressed at the global level. So there is more growing capacity requirement. But what that means for other companies is there will be opportunities to manufacture subcomponents or component manufacturing here in the region for those companies. Looking at the pandemic, looking at the logistic value challenges, everybody is trying to localize or kind of relocate manufacturing back to the base or make it as close to the manufacturing facility as possible. So this is the opportunity that we are seeing. If any company is into high voltage cables or junction boxes, or any of those manufacturing products which can both combine the advantages of the local region, but also the fact that there will be initially assembly, but then full-scale manufacturing in the future, could benefit from that shift to industrialization. Looking at the wider Middle East region, Morocco was one of the pioneers looking at the battery manufacturing, looking at subcomponents and component manufacturers for electric vehicles, but they do have an established automotive industry already. The second is charging stations. Now, we've seen that a lot of companies are moving into the CPO stage, that are becoming charging point operators. Supplying those points is becoming a business opportunity. Manufacturing, maintaining, developing payment solutions, or also operating. Not every CPO will be interested, or not every investor in the CPO space will be interested in operating them. It's a challenge. It's a very big challenge to bring together all those moving parts to make sure that the customers are able to pay for the charging opportunity, for the charging service, to make sure that all the points are being maintained and serviced. So that's an opportunity right there. And another one, which is not necessarily directly linked to electric vehicles, but the fact that electric vehicle manufacturing is booming globally, we are seeing that we are seeing a spillover effect to other industries as well. So for example, personal protective equipment market is expected to be valued at almost $800 million by 2000, or within the next 7 to 10 years, considering that the amount of manufacturing will grow so significantly that it will trigger the other investments in the indirectly related areas. So there are quite a lot of opportunities in the EV space, not only globally, but also here in the Middle East, but also here in the GCC. And we are quite excited to see global manufacturing coming to the GCC and kind of exciting those opportunities here regionally. So I think this is the end of my presentation. Let me just go back. Yeah. So if you have any questions, happy to take them. I think we have about 4 minutes left. If there are no questions, it's always great. Yeah, please.
Okay, thank you for the presentation. Do you think that the available raw materials or the capacity of electricity production can sustain the expected growth of electric vehicles in the near and far future?
Yes, are you talking about the region, or are you talking about?
No, generally. If we consider MENA or GCC especially, I think the region has more advantage than Western countries, especially to Europe, which relies on imported sources to produce electricity, where all the resources, sun, oil, gas, are available here in the region.
Yeah, so I think, yeah, it's a good question, and based on our discussions, based on our understanding, most of the utilities here have been running simulations, have been doing modeling to understand whether they have enough capacity, whether they have enough electricity. We don't believe this will be an issue until 2025, 2027. And luckily, we're looking at 2030 as of now. We're not looking beyond that. Beyond, possibly, that will lead to some issues, some challenges. Until 2030, we believe that it will not be a major issue. Of course, there will be some other related challenges. So the time of charging, will there be charging enough power at exactly the same time when most of the vehicles, if we're talking about peak time, will be charging? That will be an issue. But generally, if we look at the UAE, for example, utilities, and the grid is quite healthy, there is enough sparse capacity. Saudi has been doing similar simulations. Based on what we understand, they are ready to accept those vehicles. The question is, and obviously there will be some top limitations saying that the grid will not be able to accommodate more than a certain number. But with the forecast that we're looking at, and we're looking at about 10% of new vehicles being electric, plug-in hybrids or battery by 2030, that should not run into significant problems. Beyond 2030, that's possible, but at the same time, most utilities will have enough time to adjust for the new reality. So I'm not sure if that answered the question.
Hello. Hi, Vitali. Thanks for the excellent presentation. Following the previous question, you talk about the future cost of kilowatt hour in the batteries being reduced to $75, I think. Is that considering the current hikes in the price, and also probably the bottleneck that there will be in raw material?
So yeah, I think, yeah, good point again. Thank you, Jose. essentially, yes, we looked at, or I would essentially no, we look at the situation up to 2020, and we understand that the advancements or the development which happened until then was mainly, I would say, trouble-free. Now we're running into some challenges, as you mentioned, because of the logistic challenges. We do believe that the rate of advancements will probably slow down, but with the volumes, we're expecting it to be counter, I would say, acting some of the top level challenges. So yes, in short, the level of progress will not be the same as we saw in the last 5 to 7 years, but we still believe that those challenges can be overcome. Those are more short-term to mid-term challenges rather than long-term. So if we were looking at the TCO break-even between EVs and ICEs by about 24, 25, now the number might be looking at, we might be looking at 25 to 26, possibly to 27. But it should not be changing the overall picture significantly.
You have one last one? No? Thank you. Thanks for the presentation, Vitali. You spoke about the CapEx difference and how this would help to adopt the electric mobility here in the region. Now, speaking of OpEx, how would you compare the subsidies and the tax benefits for oil, for ICE cars, compared to the electricity prices and their subsidies and tax benefits, which would definitely play a big role to determine the profitability, or let's say the economical case of electric mobility here in the region?
So I think, yeah, it's a complex question, to be honest. I don't think I'll have the right answer now. But if we look at the end user perspective, then we are seeing that probably, or our expectation as EVs are becoming a reality in the market, the equation between the cost of electricity and the cost of petrol will change slightly, because there will be less demand for petrol, there will be more demand for electricity. There might be less subsidies being applied on the petrol side of the equation, but there will be more subsidies on the electricity. At the same time, again, I don't have the full picture, so honestly, I would not be able to answer that question right now. But we don't think it will change the situation drastically in the long term. Yes, short term, especially given the fact that there is still not enough clarity or transparency on how many vehicles there will be in operation, what that will mean for the governments. We don't really know what will happen, and that's unfortunate reality. But the thing is, right now, there is no subsidies, there is nothing which is being done, or I would say the support from the authority side is still relatively limited, which is a good thing, because we are relying on the market to drive those changes. And here we have one of the purest situations. It's all about the market, bringing the cost down, regulating the cost, or I would say, of course, electricity and petrol is a different situation. But in our equation, cost of electricity and cost of petrol are not the major factor impacting the total TCO. So even if there are some slight or even moderate changes happening on the electricity side, on the petrol side, it will not change the situation significantly. And also, as an example, if you look at the cost of petrol here in the UAE, it was about 1.8 a couple of years ago. Now it's 3.7, 3.8, depending on the octane grade. And it does not impact the situation significantly. Of course, it does change the equation, but it's not a major concern right now. So I mean, yeah, I would probably say that it's a complex question. I don't think we'll have the right answer, so it's probably better to look at it in more detail. Yeah. Thank you.